Welcome back. Let's move along to our next process. Collect requirements. Collect requirements is the process in which we collect requirements for the project. Business requirements, technical requirements, functional requirements, and so on. As you can see on the screen here, it says requirements can be collected and tracked in various ways. One way is by using a tabular matrix called a requirements traceability matrix. And that's what it looks like. This is a rather important document talked about in this aspect of project management within the PMBOK guide. Various types of requirements traceability matrices could exist. Typically, this document is used to track requirements to their origin. Requirements to their origin. And in addition to that, some variants of this could exist. You could have a requirements traceability matrix that tracks requirements to their origin and business case, or requirements to their origin and test script, or requirements to their origin and use case. It really depends on the requirements traceability matrix. So taking a look here, we can see that the major goals of this process are to document all requirements from stakeholders, to provide a base and context for further defining project and product scope, and this could be done in an iterative fashion. Typically on projects, we see people defining what needs to be done, collecting requirements in traditional, or I should say fully plan driven project management all upfront. But remember that in Agile, this could be a revolving door of requirements gathering throughout an Agile project. Let's take a look at the inputs, tools, and techniques for this process. The first one needs no introduction. It's the project charter. The project charter contains a lot of high-level information that could be relevant to this particular aspect of collecting requirements. It puts you a little bit ahead of the curve when you've got some high-level requirements, and you could refer to those and build upon those in this process. The next input here is the project management plan, and of course, as part of the project management plan, don't forget we've got the scope management plan already. We also have the requirements management plan, and another important plan is the stakeholder engagement plan that could be a relevant sub input here. Now, you'll see as you read through the PMBOK guide, there are broad inputs like project management plan, but under it we have certain bullets. For example, if you took a look at the PMBOK guide figure 5-4, you'll see certain sub-bullets under project management plan. Those, pay close attention to them. So we've got, like I said, other sub-plans that could be relevant here. The next input is project documents. Now, some of these documents that are relevant are things such as the assumptions log, lessons learned, stakeholder register, and possibly others. But remember, our stakeholder register is especially important because that contains a list of our stakeholders. It contains information about our stakeholders, and it also contains some already gleaned requirements peculiar to these stakeholders. So that should also be a relevant input here. Be very careful for your exam when you see things like project management plan or project documents broadly stated as an input, because there could be a lot more behind why those are listed. The next input here is business documents. We've got the business case. Of course, it's relevant here as we collect requirements. The next input is agreements. Any form of agreement, contract, SLA, what have you, these could contain hidden requirements that need to be brought to the surface, or maybe explicit requirements that need to be captured as we collect requirements. We have our usual one, enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Now, I'm not getting into all the details as to why these are inputs, but just remember, EEFs, factors that could influence this process, are important. Organizational process assets, if there are any previously used templates or relevant processes and procedures for conducting this process, collect requirements, of course, you should take heed to those. Let's take a look at our laundry list of tools and techniques. A lot of tools and techniques to hone in on here. The first one is expert judgment. Of course, you need experts as you're collecting requirements. Remember what we're trying to do. The mission is to document all requirements, and map to the requesters for these requirements. And expert judgment is definitely needed for that. The next one here as a tool and technique is data gathering. Data gathering. How do you gather data? How do you gather requirements data? There are a variety of ways. You could use brainstorming. You could brainstorm with a team for these requirements. What do you think is a requirement? Write them on a wall or write them on a post-it note and stick them up. It could be at random brainstorming, or it could be structured. We also have interviews. Again, it could be at random, having an interview and asking questions all over the board, or you could have a very structured interview asking specific questions about various areas of a system, for example. We also have, as a data gathering technique, focus groups talked about previously. These focus groups bring people together in a more collaborative and discussion-like fashion to glean requirements. We also could use questionnaires and surveys to glean data, to glean requirements. We could also use benchmarking. Company X used this as a benchmark for this systems project. We're working on a similar project, so let's use what their benchmark was for our project, or let's use what their targets or achievements were for this project or this system. So there are quite a few of them. You have to get used to them: brainstorming, interviews, focus groups, questionnaires and surveys, and benchmarking. Let's move on to the next one here. The next tool and technique, data analysis. And we're talking specifically about something called document analysis. So you're going to see data analysis used quite widely in the PMBOK guide, but always try to understand the specific aspect of data analysis being spoken about. So here it's document analysis. What do we do here? We examine existing documents, like business documents, for example, maybe like operational manuals, for example, to understand what the requirements are for the project. Okay. The next one here is called decision making. Decision making is talked about under interpersonal skills, and as we make decisions regarding requirements, this needs to be a skill. This needs to be a technique that's used to decide upon requirements. So decision making is pretty standard here. How do we make decisions as a team? How do we draw a line in the sand and say this is what we're going for? These are the requirements. Well, we could use voting, simple voting. We could also use something called multi-criteria decision analysis. Now, as you vote, of course, there must be a rule for, is it majority wins the vote, or are we using some other type of method to glean what requirements are going to be in the system or on the project? The next tool and technique here is data representation. Data representation has two things under this. We've got affinity diagrams. Now, affinity diagrams are used to group large amounts of data, and this amount of data that we're grouping, of course, is with a main aim of gleaning requirements. So you could group requirements by system area. You could group requirements by technical requirements, functional requirements, business requirements. And as you group them, these are typically post-it notes on a whiteboard or somewhere. But these pieces of post-it notes are really with an aim to glean in those requirements. So we call that an affinity diagram. The second one under data representation is mind mapping. And I would advise that you do a search for a mind map. Mind maps bring different ideas together. It joins one idea to the other, and each idea is used to spur another idea. And ultimately, there's a map or a web, as it were, of ideas. You could do the same when you are collecting requirements. You could use mind mapping. So all of these things that we've been talking about are ways that you're generating requirements, you're putting the big picture together for requirements, you're looking for interrelationships, and you're coming to better understand what exactly the requirements of the project are. The next tool and technique is called interpersonal and team skills. Now, interpersonal skills, also known as soft skills, deal with human interaction, being more aware of how people interact and being able to use those great skills of yours, those great interpersonal skills, to draw out data, to draw out information, to draw out requirements. That's really the main aim of this technique on this process. So under interpersonal and team skills, we've got three broad categories talked about. And of course, we're not limiting ourselves to these when we talk about interpersonal skills, but we've got nominal group technique. Now, the nominal group technique is really one in which we use the idea of ranking ideas. So you get an idea, you could rank the idea. You could use a nominal group technique to rank the idea. You could use nominal group technique to better understand people's reactions to data gathered or the requirements that have been gathered. We could also use observation and conversation to draw out requirements from people. So observation is also known as job shadowing. You could shadow someone on the job to better understand what are the steps they're going through. And from those steps, you can glean requirements. What about conversation? As you converse with the team or people who are working in a particular area, you can glean what requirements for the project should be, especially if it's, let's say, a project to replace an antiquated system or a project to help them do their job better, to maybe define certain parameters, boundaries, maybe processes and procedures in a firm. Maybe it's a process improvement project. Conversation becomes very, very important, and so does observation. The next sub-bullet that we have under interpersonal and team skills is facilitation. So this deals with being able to facilitate these focus groups or the meeting of the minds, as it were. The next tool and technique is context diagrams. Context diagrams are diagrams that show how a business system interacts with what we call actors. And these actors are entities or people who are inputting data into the system and taking data out. We call them actors. So if you look in the PMBOK guide, you'll see an example of one of these context diagrams. If you've worked in IT, you've probably seen one of these context diagrams. And the last tool and technique is called prototypes. Prototypes are very helpful in gathering early feedback about a widget, a design, maybe a deliverable. If you do a mock-up prototype, as it were, you can get feedback really quick as to whether that is what the customer had in mind, whether that's what the sponsor is thinking about or not. So the outputs of this process: requirements documentation. This refers to a document that spells out how the requirements will meet the business needs, or how the requirements map back to the business needs of the project. Some people also loosely refer to requirements documentation as any documents that pertain to requirements being collected or requirements being better defined. The next one here is requirements traceability matrix, RTM. I call it the RTM. And we took a look at this at the beginning, and we saw that it's a document that maps back requirements to their origin. Okay? So for your exam, someone will say, well, how am I going to be tested on something like requirements document? You need to know the definition. Like I said, it's a document that describes how the different requirements actually meet the business need for the project. Also, requirements traceability matrix, knowing what it is and knowing some of the different facets of the requirements traceability matrix could help you. You see, the requirements traceability matrix traces a lot of stuff, and all that information is talked about in the PMBOK guide. You need to look at, for example, each of those numbers, like 5.2.3.2 is where the requirements traceability matrix is talked about. You really need to hone in there in the PMBOK guide, zero in and understand all those bullets and keep them in your head for the exam. Those two outputs, very big. Also on the exam, I expect questions on the tools and techniques. There are so many sub-techniques and sub-tools in this area. It's almost unbelievable how many you've got in requirements. So many teeny weeny little bits of sub-bullets that could easily be a question each. If you take a look at the collect requirements process, the techniques and tools, you could probably get easily, or I should say I could probably write 30 questions from this process alone. So you really need to know all the bits and pieces of those sub-bullets. When we take a look at the inputs to this process, they're kind of familiar, but you do need to know the specific aspects, like I said, of the project management plan and project documents that are relevant here. So this could be huge. It could be really big on your exam.